Hi, everyone. Welcome to this new episode of Lunch and Learn. This episode will be on Code 699. We finally received a decision from the Public Sector Labor Relation and Employment Board. So we will go over the decision today. So first of all, welcome back. My name is David Girard. I'm the Senior Union Representative for the National Office of GSU. So this session is intended to activists working with members in the public service corps, so working for one of the department that are covered by either of the collective agreement, PASV, TC, and so on, because they all contain the same wording. So first of all, what is Code 699? So it's a code that you are using in the employer system that became vastly known after the pandemic started in 2020. But in fact, it's related to your collective agreement. And it's usually on around Article 53 that talks of leave with or without pay for other reasons. So Article 53 reads as follows. At his discretion, the employer may grant leave with pay where circumstances not directly attributed to the employee prevent his or her reporting for duty. Such leave shall not be unreasonably withheld. B, leave with or without pay for purposes other than those specified in this agreement. So before 2020, the most common use for Code 699 leave with pay for other reason was basically snow day. So when you were unable to report to work due to poor conditions on the roads, travel issue also. So we have had some members that booked travel that was last minute cancellation of planes. We had a volcano incident, and other cases where, for example, we have no electricity during winter and you need to be at your house to maintain heat and make sure. So those are circumstances where, for reasons that are not directly attributed to your work, to you, while you are able and ready, you cannot report to work. Then the pandemic hit. So we'll keep it short there. I think we've all had plenty of discussion about the pandemic, but overall in March 2020, most of the federal offices closed. So we have had some essential workers, but most of you and me started to report to work from our homes. So two policy grievances were filed following the employer issuing policy on use of the 699 code. So there was two issues that were raised in both of those grievances. The first one was discrimination, so that the employer policy was discriminatory in nature and was targeting certain groups, and the groups were family status, disability, and sex. And the other argument was that it was contravening to the collective agreement itself. So a couple of housekeeping. So the adjudicator started by determining that there is two leave, right? There is leave with pay, where circumstances not directly attributed to you, and there is leave with or without pay for other reasons. So the employer tried to make an argument that B should apply, but it was turned down by the arbitrator, and she mostly argued that it was an admission from the employer in their own documents, and over the last 2 years that they repeatedly used a test that was set up in Article 5301A, which is for circumstances not directly attributed to you. So after that, the arbitrator looked at what is the test to determine if the policy was reasonable or not reasonable. So the guideline, the test is, was it a reasonable exercise of managerial discretion? And her rationale on this specific aspect was an employee is unable to come to work through no fault of his or her own, should the employee be granted leave with pay. The answer to that question will depend on individual circumstances, and to that extent, I agree that the employer is allowed to set conditions to evaluate the employee's need and the extent that he or she cannot report to work. Requiring medical attestation and making inquiry about the possibility of flexible hours can be a reasonable exercise of managerial authority. So, in a nutshell, the fact that the employer put a policy on top of the collective agreement article was deemed to be reasonable on its own. But now we need to look at the content of such policy. So, for the first grievance, was looking. It was made in May of 2020, so at the very beginning, and it was focusing basically on two aspects. So high risk workers with a medical condition, and also parents who choose to keep their kids at home once the school or the daycare reopened. So first of all, we'll start with the ruling on the discrimination argument for this grievance. So regarding high-risk worker, the arbitrator concluded that the May policy does not take into account medical reasons for granting. The May policy does take into account medical reasons for granting 699 leave with a medical attestation. People at risk from COVID-19 are therefore not targeted. So the discrimination argument was turned down. Regarding parents would choose to keep their kids at home, the board continued with, as regards parents who prefer to keep their child at home, the questions becomes more of one of choice, not of right. Both Johnstones and Flatt make very clear that there is no discrimination when parents make choices that may be in conflict with their work obligations. Where public health authorities have deemed that reopening schools and daycare can be safely done, parents can choose to keep their children at home, but this is a choice and not a right protected by human right legislation. So once again, she turned down the no discrimination argument for this case. So she went on with the ruling and of the violation itself of the collective agreement for the parents who choose to keep their kids at home. So she continues, the board member continued by stating that the main concern expressed in the first grievance was that the employer was not respecting the choice some parents make to not send their kids to school. I believe this guidance made the distinctions between true medical concerns, such as high-risk individual in the household, and personal choice, preferring not to send a child to school or daycare, despite the recommendations of public health authorities. I can find no violation of the collective agreement. It seems to me that the policy is flexible enough to allow accounting for true concerns. If the transmission rate in a given community is high, if a member of an household is high risk, or if a child is particularly vulnerable, the policy and guidance allow for that assessment. Requiring medical attestation is burdensome, but does not violate the collective agreement. So she concluded that there is no breach of the collective agreement for the policy that the Treasury Board issued in May 2020. It does not mean that there is not some leeway. As I've just read in the last paragraph, the employer, it's already in their policy that they need to take into account some personal circumstances. So we need to make sure when we are reviewing grievances that were filed that the employer did just that. So the second policy, so that's for the first policy grievance. The second policy grievance was mostly aiming after the decision when Treasury Board reviewed their policy in October of 2020 with effective date of November, that our members are required to use other leave before accessing 699. So they were asked to empty their banks of sick leave, family-related, and vacation. So the targeted group in that case was family needing to use family-related and worker unable to work from home, depleting their sick leave bank faster. Okay, so we first started, the board first started with the discrimination argument, saying that this policy was discriminatory for family status, disability, and sex. The board concluded that I find the forced depletion of leave to be problematic, as I will explain later, but I have not been convinced that this is necessarily discriminatory. This is a case where its application is adverse for all. In addition, I find that the employer is aware of the needs of different vulnerable populations, and it has taken pains to stress the case-by-case assessment of every request, precisely to allow managers to gauge each employee's need. If error were made, they can be corrected, but those are individual instances, not the subject of a policy grievance. So the employer gender basis analysis study, as well as consideration given to the importance of assessing cases individually, have convinced me that the employer is well aware of his responsibility from a human right point of view. Therefore, I do not find the November policy to be discriminatory. So the first argument about the no discrimination failed. But then we go into, is there a breach of the collective agreement by the employer forcing depletion of leave? And the board concluded as such. The one element of the policy or guidance that strike me as unreasonable because it goes against the collective agreement and impose an undue burden on employees is the message given to manager that they must consider other leave before granting 699 leave. I find that requiring the manager employee to consider other paid leave is a violation of the collective agreement. One of the witnesses insisting that all leave has to be exhausted before 699 leave would be considered was an extreme example of what can go wrong with this policy. So more specifically, with regard to sick leave, the board concluded that sick leave has been negotiated to ensure that employees who are ill need not to worry about their income. In Smith, a previous decision, the board ruled that it was unreasonable to grant sick leave when the employee could not report to work because of circumstances beyond his control. In this case, it was a snowstorm. I find it unreasonable for the employer to consider sick leave when the pandemic prevents attending at work, unless, of course, the employee is ill. So specifically regarding family related, the board concluded that it is unreasonable to use leave that is meant for another purposes, short-term events, for a reality that may be ongoing. As stated by one of the witness, were it not for the pandemic, his child would have been at school and he would have been at work. He should not have to use family-related leave to cover that eventuality. It should not be exhausted as in another griever situation. That leave exists to cover other needs, such as appointment and school closure for other reasons. So lastly, regarding use of vacation before 699, the board concluded that management shows its ambivalence on this issue in a third witness's case. She was told to use vacation leave to cover her absence, only to have it reinstated when she grieved the decision. So if the witness is entitled to bank her vacation leave credits, why would other employee have to use their vacation leave when requesting 699 leave? Again, discussing using vacation leave in a given year is a proper activity between a manager and his or her employee, but it should not be confused with the need for 699 leave if the employee is ready and willing to work, but is unable to due to circumstances beyond his or her control. Therefore, I find that adding the requirement to consider other leave before considering an employee's request for 699 violates the collective agreement, as it's an unreasonable withholding of 699 leave. This conclusion is premised on the understanding that the employee is ready and able to work. This is something that the boards heavily rely on, that the employee, our member, needs to demonstrate that they are ready and able to work. So what are the next steps? So the board the board main conclusion with regard to the two to the second policy grievance, because the first one was dismissed, is I will not make an order to grant 699 leave to all who requested it. Based on the decision, it's very clear for the board that it needs to be an individual assessment. The employer is entitled to explore and determine whether remote and flexible arrangements are possible, and the extent to which an employee cannot come to work because of medical reason that applies to the employee or an household member. A medical attestation by a medical practitioner may be required. The community prevalence of the COVID-19 virus and public health information may be factored in deciding whether an employee can return to work safely, and whether it is reasonable to expect parents to send their children to school or daycare. An employee who is sick and unable to work is expected to use sick leave. So in short, what does that mean for you as activists? So if grievances were filed by your members and those grievances are still at your level, please communicate with your member, making sure to understand what is their personal circumstances. If their personal circumstances are directly linked to this policy grievance decision, reach out to the employer and try to informally resolve that. Should that not be an option, you can continue the formal grievance route. If no grievances were filed and a member approached you saying, hey, I've been made aware of this, what can I do? Do not hesitate to have informal conversation with the employer, trying to see if there is any appetite for the employer to resolve this. Should this fail, use the knowledge tree to raise the issue and determine if we can or if we cannot file a grievance. So I will just take a minute to look in the chat. I see no comments, so I want to welcome you all for your participation, and looking forward to talk or see you in the near future. Thank you. Bye-bye.